Good morning, everyone. My name is Tushar Patel. I'm one of the Canadian Science Policy Centre Program Committee members and volunteer. I work at the University of Lethbridge as a Canada Research Chair in RNA and Protein Biophysics and as an Associate Dean at the Faculty of Arts and Science. We are privileged today to have Dr. Les Jacobs from the Ontario Tech University. Dr. Jacobs has authored numerous books, numerous multiple papers. His research is very exciting, and as a recognition of his outstanding research profile, he was recognized with the highest honor as the Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada in 2017. Before joining the Ontario Tech University as the Vice President for Research and Innovation, Dr. Jacobs had held Tier 1 Canada Research Chair as well, so lots of research experience and lots of leadership experience. And we are lucky to have some of his time today to get some conversation points. And with that, Dr. Jacobs, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, so my first conversation point or question today is considering your role and considering how rapidly Ontario Tech University has come up as one of the leaders in the technology development and innovation space. If you'd like to share some of the next points that you are focusing on or some of the achievements that you want to highlight, it'll be nice for you to share with us.
Sure, and I mean one of the noteworthy things about Ontario Tech is so that we literally just celebrate our 20th anniversary, and we are still the newest research-intensive university in Canada because it's difficult to build research intensivity. It takes time, and at Ontario Tech, I joined in 2019, and I partly joined because I thought there was a great opportunity to be really impactful as a research leader, and a lot of our academic programs had been sort of cemented, but our research intensity, our research enterprise was sort of at the cusp of really kind of pushing forward. Part of the reason that I've been a fan of the conference for a long time, but part of the reason the conference appeals to me in particular is because it very much fits with the vision and approach that I brought to Ontario Tech that we've really been implementing. And the way I tend to frame it is most research intensive universities are use what I call a push approach. Okay. So they actually develop cool research, cool technology, and then they push it out into the market and hope it sticks. Yeah. But in general, realistically, a teeny fraction of it actually sticks. And the approach that I've really sort of been leading our implementation at Ontario Tech is to try to predominantly be a pole university. Yeah. And so by a pole university, I mean exactly what we do is we go out and up front spend an immense amount of time listening to our industry partners, our community partners, government, and really identify what their research needs are. And often they don't exactly know what the research needs are, at least what the university can provide. Yeah. And so there's a lot of dialogue, a lot of conversation, a lot of my staff. So I tend to highlight too that as a research intensive university, my office is quite distinctive because I have the same number of staff who are partnership engagement officers as grants officers, because we see that as strategically such a fundamental investment. And I'd like to kind of say that it's been quite noticeable how quickly it's been genuinely impactful. We sort of have jumped 10 spots in the sort of use research ranking kind of position, but sort of more importantly, the kinds of the rankings by InfoSource. We're going to be ranked -- in the country among small universities in a couple weeks, we entered. We had never been ranked in the top 700 universities by the Times Higher Education rankings for universities under 50. We entered those rankings last year at 180th, and I think it's going to turn out to be that we're second in the country by the next rankings. And I think the university that's newer than us is actually turning 50 years old.
Wow.
So there's really been but it comes to that it's a differentiated approach, and you can see why I think the pretty consistent message that we hear at the conference, and I heard from the conference long before I went to Ontario Tech, was the importance of that what I care pull approach. And I do think it's a transformational piece. I think it comes back to recognizing that so many of our faculty, most people who get into academic research, don't particularly want to do esoteric research. They want to do research that matters. And this is an opportunity to do impact, research matters. And of course, the very convenient piece for me as well is that part of the strategic judgment about the pull approach is identifying opportunities where can really be showcased. And probably the highest profile one in the last year has been, we've led Project Arrow. We built Project Arrow, Canada's first electric vehicle, 54 industry partners from around the world, but with really innovative first automotive chassis made with additive manufacturing. And we really see it as not only Canadian innovation, but international innovation. We launched it at Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas at the beginning of the year, and we're going to end in December showcasing it at the UN Climate Change Conference in Dubai in a couple weeks. So it's very much that not only are we improving our reputation and strength in Canada, but we see that as going hand in hand, doing it on an international stage. And I think that that's true about all Canadian research. All Canadian research is world class, and when we're, as a university, we're trying to be among Canadian leaders, that means that we're comfortable competing on the world stage.
Yeah. No, thank you. I really appreciate your approach. And I, as a researcher myself, as you said, I like to focus on the points that matters to the society, and that helps to deliver world-class research, problem-solving research. So thanks for that perspective. Now, you have a very interesting background working with privacy policies, with human rights issues, with societal justice. And we are in the era where artificial intelligence has picked up quite a bit, and there are conversations on what is the role and where do these topics fit with the usage of AI. And as I said, you have immense amount of experience. So where does your own work and your research fit, and what does that tell us?
So I'll say I'll sort of give you sort of two pieces of a story.
Okay.
One is a story that is, in my view, incredibly undertold, but so important for, frankly, again, almost everybody attending this conference.
Yeah.
40 years ago, last month, the Royal Commission report on inequality was released. It was chaired by Justice Rosalie Abella, who subsequently then ended up became a justice on the Supreme Court of Canada, and one of our sort of most best-known jurists. And and she was appointed under a Liberal government, Pierre Trudeau, and was Prime Minister. And Justice Abella, sort of interestingly, again, noting that she came from a legal background, frankly not that dissimilar from me in some respects. I'm not a lawyer, but in some respects, certainly around the social justice and human rights concerns. And but she divided American society. So her solution was that Canada's public policy should not use the language of race. And she introduced in that report the language of visible minority. And interestingly enough, new government, conservative government in 1984, under Prime Minister Mulroney, who in effect largely adopted her recommendations in the Employment Equity Act. And so Canada stopped, and Statistics Canada stopped collecting race data.
That information, yeah.
They began to focus on visible minority. And for anybody who operated in any public space for 30 years, we constantly heard about visible minority language. And but as a serious data scientist and human rights expert, even though it was well intended, it had very bad policy outcomes, underappreciated policy outcomes. What wasn't appreciated in Canada, I still don't think people realize it, is that the international human rights community said, this is a bad idea. And Canada was consistently critiqued on the international human rights platforms for using the language of visible minority and pretending that racialized identities were not the lived reality of Canadians. But more importantly, when it comes to basic areas of public sector, education, healthcare, the justice system, what visible minority approach did was it masked immense inequalities. So one of my running examples is take the Toronto District School Board, and you looked at high school graduation rates. If you use a visible minority calculation, visible minorities graduate at roughly about a 90%, 91% rate. White students graduate at about 83%. More or less, there's a bit of flexibility year to year, but not a problem, right? If you were to look at visible minority graduation rates, not an issue at all. But if you disaggregate the race data, there are immense racial differences. In particular, if you disaggregate Black students, there you see graduation rates 10, 15% below white students, and say 30% below Southeast and South Asian students. And likewise, if you shift to healthcare, the idea of trying to calibrate healthcare without focusing on race is so fundamentally inconsistent with so much of the advances that have been happening in healthcare, in individualized healthcare, so on. and in the third area, and arguably the area where I've done the most work, the justice system, things like racial profiling make no sense if you focus on visible minority.
Yeah.
So shift to my own work. I had sort of the interesting opportunity to or a series of human rights cases that didn't put a finger on this problem, but identified issues about racial profiling, driving while black cases, and so on. And we had no data to actually deal with them. So I had the terrific opportunity as a consequence of a human rights tribunal case to lead the biggest racial profiling data collection project still in Canada. It's now 10 years old.
Wow.
And we have now collected probably more than 1 million cases.
Wow.
But more importantly, what it did, what we were able to do was to step back and treat as an academic side, say, what should be the data standards? What kind of race classifications should we be using? How should we be undertaking analysis? What kind of community engagement we should be
Asking
doing?
all the right questions.
All of these things that had never really been done in there's a bit in the healthcare section, and in Ontario in particular, in the LHINs. So we designed this study and began in 2012, and we released the first report in 2015, and it was not only shocked, I mean, in a way it confirms some people sort of lived experiences, but for example, it shocked the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Their view was the data we should collect is black, white, and other, because they didn't think that there were any issues around racialized identities other than Indigenous and black. We, for example, because of community consultations, heard consistently from the Middle Eastern community that you want to collect data. And again, for somebody who kind of came out of post 9/11, it wasn't a surprise that there were young Middle Eastern men were feeling like they're being profiled by the criminal justice system. So we produced this data, and this is where comes this policy issue, opportunity. Our report issued, the cabinet secretary for Ontario government contacts me and says, will you be a principal consultant for us to kind of develop a policy on this? It literally like weeks after the report came out. And I said to them, well, you know what you should do is get me to write a white paper. So I wrote a white paper, or we wrote a white paper, it was co-authored paper, that did two things. It told that story about the visible minority, which is not a well-told story, and that this is why you need to begin to collect race data. And secondly, if you look in other jurisdictions outside of Canada, a policy is not what you need. You need legislation. And so very quickly, within weeks of me submitting that white paper, the province moved to say, we're going to introduce an anti-racism act. And the core of the Anti-Racism Act is the data standard. And in effect, I work really closely with the Minister of the Attorney General on drafting that legislation. And more importantly, around the regulations in the law setting the first race data standard in Canada. And that race data standard came into effect in 2018 and is still gradually being fully implemented across education, children's service, child protection, education, and the justice system. And so we're getting real data that, in lots of respects, is reconfirming the experience of racialized communities. But there's real data. There's real ways to push that forward. And the spin-off, the second province to introduce an anti-racism act, Nova Scotia, my home province, they introduced an act in 2022, roughly modeled on the Ontario legislation called Dismantling Racism and Hate. I was also principal consultant on that data standard, and it's sort of without good data. And any scientist knows that you have to have good data, and to address such a fundamental feature of Canadian public policy.
Yeah.
And in a way, it's almost hard to believe that we've entered so late in the
game.
But it's anyhow, it's a terrific story. Well, I mean, terrific. It's an interesting story. To come back to your AI point.
Yeah.
The compelling feature is now we are collecting immense amounts of data.
Mm-hmm.
Like I say, in Ottawa, I'm just doing a 10-year report, so 10 years of data, about 1 million cases. Incredible potential for machine learning and AI applications, and really pushing new controversial pieces. One of my prides, sort of theoretically, about the Anti-Racism Act here in Ontario is that in the legislation calls race a social construction, which it is, but traditionally in social sciences, a lot of reservation about race as a cause, because there's traditional skepticism about how race could be a cause, because it's an intervention. You understand the basic, but intuitively, and when you're in these communities, of course they see race as a cause. They see race as a trigger for why police or why they're mistreated in emergency departments, whatever. And when you and trying to use AI and machine learning to really develop that kind of data is a powerful new way to approach it. And of course, and then you get sort of predictive ways. More generally, I think that the type of challenges we are having, and we are arguably having with AIs, it just frankly increased the currency. I wrote a book in 2013, 2014 that was funded principally by the Privacy Commissioner, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, that was about privacy rights in the global digital economy, and the sort of central point there, bit of a story. Again, people know the story, but it's maybe not fully appreciated, that in the 1970s, 1980s, privacy rights were principally about, they were framed largely around American jurisprudence, including in Canada, but around Roe versus Wade, this kind of privacy of people's own decisions and so on. And that shift to the value of personal information. And we all now get that privacy is principally around, and the tensions with having market economies where that personal information is so commodified and there's so much value tied into it. And the part of the obvious story about AI and machine learning uses of personal information is that it's just increases the value even more. And even in the 10 years since I wrote that book, that obvious point, and that book focused on social media and privacy, but now people just realizing that the personal information partly is social media, but it's everywhere, including all this data collection that so many of us advocate for in anonymized kind of forms. But at what point does it? It's pretty reasonable to say that smart technology will make anonymous data far, far more difficult.
So this is a great conversation, but I really appreciate your perspective because your experience ties up in how we move forward with AI and other technology. And also, you covered my last question about the use of this conference because of your work in the policy domain, because your work with the government officials and now with the university. So I'm thinking that this conference gives enough platform for conversation points on these topics, on knowledge dissemination, gathering the data, and data processing. With that, I really thank you, Dr. Jacobs, for your time, for your knowledge sharing, and for participating in CSPC annual conference. And I hope to see you again.
I'm sure you will. And I would say that the two team members that I've brought from the university have not attended before, and and they've actually found it
very useful,
very useful, and unique, right? That's part of the feature of the conference. It is a very unique dynamic.
Thank you. We'd appreciate that.